Hey everybody, we're the good doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Erin.
I'm Dr. Kristen.
You are very welcome to our channel. We are two doctors with PhDs in social science who love having conversations about everything from systemic racism to the romantic tropes in Bridgerton and all that lies in between. We are educators who focus specifically on building empathy and inclusivity through these conversations that we have in a myriad of ways. So today we're having a very specific conversation,
which we have in our hot-ish takes series, of which this is a part, where there are so many things in culture that require quick takes, and we often do those in our Good Doctors Diagnose series that are a little bit potentially less serious, things that require research and reflection and contemplation, and if we need to like emote off camera first, go into our hot-ish takes. And today is part of that category. We're going to be talking about the large concept that is being bandied about a lot in the news right now. As we record this, it is the end of March 2021, and the country is still on the heels of the terrorist attack in Atlanta against Asian American Pacific Islander, several of whom were sex workers. And several of whom were not, but that a piece of this was purity culture. And there's been some really great op-eds explaining what that is. We're going to be linking to Caitlin Beatty is one of my favorite essayists in this, and we're going to be linking to a couple things. Our personal hero, Richard Lynn Hollander, has also weighed in. So we'll be linking to a whole lot of other people's takes, opinions, etc. But I want to be completely honest here. If I haven't said it on a video that you've watched, I was raised in the evangelical subculture, and I was raised with a capital R in it. I was big. It was my whole worldview. I had a True Love Waits ring. I signed the pledge. I went to an evangelical Christian college. It was my whole worldview. And while I have since left that piece of the system, I have not left my faith. However, the baggage of growing up with that in your ear is profound and long-reaching. And I've done some research on how women who leave the faith navigate their bodies after it. It's very, very complicated. How evangelical Christianity and a lot of Christianity, to be honest, talks about sexuality and bodies is real specific. And if it's not part of the world that you know, you may not be familiar with this at all. However, because America was founded by Puritans, God love them, in so many ways, and because evangelical Christianity is so powerful in terms of money and political influence, purity culture is not just an evangelical thing. And so as Dr. Erin and I were talking about this, we wanted to offer both perspectives, somebody in this particular subculture and somebody completely out of this particular subculture, to show the pervasiveness of this myth that women are in charge of the sexuality of the entire society.
And I think what's so important about presenting like both these perspectives is, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to understand this aspect of evangelical culture, and to particularly understand the damage that it does to men and women and non-binary folks and everybody in between, but specifically the toxic nature of it for men and women and how they see themselves. But it's also really important to understand why things like what took place, the violent hate crime attack that took place in Atlanta, why they happen, and that it is also embedded in our culture. And so what I've learned from basically just being adjacent to Dr. Kristen throughout a number of events that have happened in our 10-year friendship is providing that context and that framework for understanding the origins of these ideas about men's and women's bodies and sexual behaviors and activity and blame and shame and all of those things that go with it. Understanding the context of where they come from to help me better understand where I can see it in society. And that was a little convoluted, but hopefully clear enough. But I think for me, you know, I have started to recognize when it happens, when people say elements, you know, talk about elements of purity culture. I recognize it. I recognized it when people started talking about the shooter in Atlanta, not to the same extent that Dr. Kristen did, which is, I think, kind of what we can get back to after I share some of my experiences. But certainly, I grew up a-religious, not tied to any particular faith or tradition. And it was still a part of the culture that I lived in. I still remember in 7th grade, because it was the 1990s and everybody had spaghetti strap tank tops.
My God, didn't we? Like, why did
everybody?
And we didn't wear them as layering things. We just wore them. Yeah, it's a time in all of our lives.
Like, I didn't go to a school that had uniforms, but we certainly had a dress code policy.
Yeah, us too.
I remember girls getting way more punished for violations of the dress code.
Did you guys have the fingertips thing where your shorts had to be down to your fingertips?
I think so.
That was like every public school around here had that girls had to stand with their fingertips, and all of us were annoyed because some girls had shorter arms than others. And how
right, like it's so subjective.
Yeah.
And they don't take hardly anything into consideration. But like, I remember that, and I remember the conversations that were had as I was growing up, and the conversations I've had as a young woman, and as now approaching my 40s woman, which is very different from your early 20s, for those of you that don't know.
Oh my God, we have to start calling ourselves middle-aged in a couple of years.
I almost said it, but then I was like, no, because I think that like we've still got a couple of years. But I think part of this politicization and kind of policing of women's clothing and bodies and behavior in public spaces that starts from things like school dress codes.
Yeah.
Is a huge part of this broader culture of purity culture and gendered expectations for how people are supposed to behave in society. And I think Dr. Kristen will be really helpful to get into the specifics and the origins of purity culture, but we can see it everywhere. And if you follow us on this Hottish Take series, the Hottish Take before this was about the murder of a young woman in the UK, Sarah Everard. And we had very similar conversations about policing her behavior or other women's behavior, and women starting to push back against this. It's not what I wear. It's not whether or not I take a taxi. It's not my responsibility. But that idea that it is our responsibility is so embedded in the culture that a person who had zero interaction with evangelical Christianity growing up, aside from living in the like epicenter of it in my hometown in Colorado, but I still didn't engage with it. It still impacted the way I saw myself as a woman, the way I behaved in public, the way I talk about sex and sexuality, all of that. So I think it's so important to know that like you don't have to be in evangelical culture to have this significantly impact your life. But if you are or have been in evangelical culture, it significantly impacts your life more than if you aren't. And I think we're gonna hand over the reins. There's somebody else hosting. we'll hand it over to Dr. Kristen to talk a bit about what purity culture is, where it came from, and how damaging it is for those people that are really embedded inside it.
First of all, let me say that almost every fundamentalist branch of any religion has a basis in purity culture as well. So the particular like insidiousness, the particular way it manifests in America is largely from the evangelical movement, but because that's the one that has the most money and the most power, and that's the one that has infiltrated Washington, to use like those kind of words, but very conservative evangelical. Like, I mean, you hear the Billy Graham rule. You Vice President Pence was somebody who talked about that. So, but fundamentalist movements within Islam have this, fundamentalist movements within Judaism, within Buddhism. Like, there's a lot of innate fears around women's bodies that go constantly. And some of this to me is fairly explainable in that like they couldn't figure out why we kept bleeding, and blood has to do with demons in a lot of places.
It's super scary. And
it's super scary. You died giving birth to kids. Like, there's still parts of the world where you sit on hay for 7 days because you don't have tampons. Like, women's hormones appear a whole lot more vicarious and weird than men's are. Teenage girls are the most feared piece of our species, I think, in a lot of ways. And legit.
Because they're hormonal and menstruating at the
They're hormonal and menstruating, and God, we just don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And mix on top of that I'm not a sex researcher. It's like a hobby of mine. It's not something I've ever really delved into, but like, I don't understand why humans are so afraid of talking about sex, but God, we are. And there's very few cultures in which it's sex positive. There's very few cultures, and those have been evolutions, except for maybe France. But there's all of that. So let me say that the fear of women's bodies is almost universal. A piece of that is because we are the ones that propagate the species. And so there is an innate animalistic primal thing that women need to be protected because 2 men cannot propagate the species. And so we have to do that on some level. Now, really, if we wanted to protect women and propagate the species, we would do things like have appropriate like reproductive health care, and we would make sure that things like breast cancer are prioritized in funding, and all of that would happen. But we don't actually think like that. So we police their sexual activity instead. But we are very concerned with the propagation of the species, which is fair. We have to do that. There are people who study population control for a reason. And population growth. And we've talked, I think, in a couple of our colonized world tours about that there are countries that are concerned with population.
Oh, for sure.
And what that looks like. Often within religious movements, sexual purity is tied to devotion to God. That is another fairly common thing. Now, within the 90s evangelical subculture that a lot of millennials that have come out of that are talking about now, that you have heard a lot of us speaking of, there was a thing called True Love Waits, which you may or may not know. It was a massive, massive moneymaker, but it was essentially a pledge that you signed to respect your parents, to respect your church, to respect God, to respect your future spouse and your future children, you would abstain from sexual relationships until marriage. So it's a lot of people that have a say in your sexual choices. We never actually talked about what sex meant, which is why actually the highest number of STDs in college students were among college students who signed the True Love Waits pledge in the early 2000s, because nobody taught us about condoms or sexually transmitted diseases. But there was a lot of people involved in your sexuality. There have been a lot of studies. Friend of the company, friend of the doctors, Dr. Catherine McAleese, did her PhD on sexually active Christians who are sexually active outside of marriage and the shame culture that surrounds them and what that kind of looks like. There's lots and lots of books. Future guest of Abbey Research, Diana Anderson, has written a great book on purity myth. We're going to be linking all of this in a continually updating Google resource sheet, a Google Doc resource sheet on purity culture that you can dig into. True Love Waits has fallen apart as a movement, but like you could buy rings. They actually encouraged fathers to buy rings for their daughters. And there is still a movement to have purity balls in some parts of the United States where fathers are very much seen as in charge of their daughter's sexuality. However, outside of the culture, every time somebody makes a joke about not letting their daughter date until she's 35, that's purity culture. Every time you call a girl a slut for having more than one sexual experience, that's purity culture. Every time a bro gets high-fived for conquests, that's purity culture. As we record this, everything happening with David Dobrik and his vlog squad is purity culture. All of that is purity culture, all of it. So what is in particular, and that may be tangential, but at the core of it, one of the things that a lot of very Southern Baptist, conservative Presbyterians, conservative non like evangelicals are taught is that sex innately is bad, and that it is only for making children, and it is only for the person you're going to spend the rest of your life with. That's it, done. You're not ever taught about sex being pleasurable. So that then when you get yourself into a situation in which all of a sudden something feels good, you don't know what to do with that because you haven't been prepared for that. And if something feels good, it means that you're sinning, and it means that you're failing God, and you're failing your church, and you're failing your future spouse. Normal sexual urges are often framed as sin, which is how you get this idea of sex addiction, which is how you get something that makes a lot of money, which is sending conservative boys, especially, to programs to recover from porn and masturbation addictions. Could those boys have unhealthy relationships with pornography? Absolutely. Is pornography something that is very complicated? Absolutely. Is desiring to masturbate when you are a 14-year-old boy problematic? It is not. It is not. Science tells us that it is, in fact, very normal.
It is.
Being a girl, a 14-year-old girl who wants to do that is also, science tells us, very normal. Being somebody who doesn't want to, science tells us, is also okay. All of these things are okay. But in evangelical, I mean, I keep saying evangelical because it's the shorthand in my mind, but anybody who subscribes to these beliefs, if you have never been in a church or in a religion or in any sort of relationship with God, you may not be able to understand this. Wow, that just stirred up some real feelings in me. The idea of letting down and disappointing this being that you spend your entire life trying to serve. Guys, it's like a gut punch. It's like you are constantly ashamed of yourself. And everything I've read about the shooter in Atlanta, who had a lot of other things like being a racist and a white supremacist and a whole lot of other things, but I'm just touching the purity culture here, spent a lot of his life fighting against what was totally human. And he was constantly shamed for it. This is also where a lot of like the gay conversion therapy comes from, which is actually classified as a human rights abuse by a lot of people, including your good doctors here. This is where a lot of this comes from. It's real easy if you didn't grow up in this to make fun of it. I get it. I get that it sounds really, really crazy to make fun of kids, to like say that porn is bad, or like it's punchlines and everything. I get it. Religious folks are often punchlines and things because we seem really, really weird. I get it. And I certainly make fun of us with the best of them. This comes from a very, very explainable place. And it's probably assumptions you are living under as well, just like Dr. Erin shared. I am not asking you to excuse this gentleman because what his behavior is not excusable. I am also asking you to investigate that the same thing that drove him to do that is the thing that would shame those women for the profession in the first place. And that you are probably part of that system as well. And that it is pernicious. It is baked into American culture. The valuing of women almost exclusively as either sexual objects or propagators of the species. And subconsciously, we have baked that into how we understand gender dynamics, which leads to incredible trauma for anyone who exists outside of a cisgendered heterosexual paradigm, and then leads to a whole lot of problems for anyone who has understood their bodies as their own bodies and not placed primacy on delayed gratification. Just a side thing, like I have lots of friends that grew up in evangelicalism that are in really sexually healthy relationships now. And when they hear that delayed gratification is a kink, they actually start to like tremor. Like they cannot imagine how delayed gratification could be an okay thing because that's your entire existence based on it. Something that may have never occurred to you. That's cool. We're pretty sex positive on this channel, and we haven't really like come out and said that, but I want to say that here. I am somebody who is still unpacking a lot of my baggage around purity culture, as you can tell. Dr. Erin is a big part of that, but there are also pieces, and this is one of the reasons that empathy is so important for us. We have very similar lives, and on paper, we look pretty similar in a lot of ways. There are pieces of our souls that each of us carries that the other person will never be able to touch. And the best thing that we can do is just be honest with each other and say, this is how this hit me. So there are lots of things that, I mean, we've been talking about my baggage a little bit more because it's been very national news recently. I promise I'll be making Dr. Erin talk about hers sometime soon. Don't you worry. Just kidding. But it exists for everyone. And I hope that while we are calling out everything that led to this incredibly tragic hate crime, we are also calling out all the ways in which each of us chooses to perpetuate purity culture on a regular basis.
And watching the nation, I think, grapple with what happened, especially after the year that we've all been through, I think always solidifies for me the need to have conversations like this.
Yeah.
Because if we don't examine these root causes and the context that Dr. Kristen just laid out in such a detailed and very personally affecting way, we won't understand where these people come from. And then we can't dismantle those systems that put them in these positions to have these ideas. Again, not excusing the behavior of the shooter in Atlanta. He had a lot of things going on for him. But this was a part of understanding why he felt that way about women. We didn't even get into the hypersexualized nature of Asian women and Asian Americans. Like, that's a whole other hot-ish take, but that's a huge part of this, is
Absolutely.
that white American women are pure and protected, and women of color are not. And especially as we're learning more and more about Asian Americans and Asian experiences over this year, I know Dr. Kristen and I have both learned a lot more about America's involvement in several wars in Southeast Asia that has also furthered this idea that Asian women are supposed to be sex workers or supposed to function in a way for the sexual gratification of men. And a lot of our understanding in American culture comes from our involvement in those conflicts in Southeast Asia and Korea and Vietnam and Cambodia specifically. So there's a lot of layers to any of these, but the underlying layer of a lot of it is this purity culture. And it's so important, the way Dr. Kristen talked about it, very specifically to evangelical culture, but I hope with me kind of bookending her, you can see ways that we all adhere to it, that we all perform parts of it. And that's problematic too, because, we say all the time, one of our favorite Game of Thrones quotes, what is seen cannot be unseen. And so we exist in this space to be the people to show you things so that you can see it everywhere and start to dismantle it, both within yourself and within culture, which is a lot of hard work. Mm-hmm. It's never ending. Sorry for that. There's no finish line for this work. We just keep unpacking. One of my favorite Ani DeFranco quotes, since I'm quoting everybody these days, is, for every lie I unlearn, I learn something new. So we're busy unlearning a lot here at Abbey Research, and we invite you, as always, to come along with us and unlearn what we can and relearn what we need to, so that we can work towards building those empathetic and inclusive cultures that we want to see.
We thank you for your time today and always. If we can be a resource as you do that unlearning and unpacking, like Dr. Erin said, please join us. But we're sure that you have to unlearn and relearn different things than we do. And we want to be part of your process too, so that we can learn, etc. It all has to be done together. There's resources below. If you've got other resources for us to add to that living Google sheet, please don't hesitate. If this has been a part of your life and you'd like to come and talk to us about it, we would love that too. So links to get in touch with us are below wherever you are experiencing this material. How to get a hold of us is pretty easy. We're at Abbey Research across all the socials except for TikTok because it scares us. And we will see you next time for whatever is hot and needs to be ished, or on any of our other content across our channels. Again, thank you for your consideration.
Take care, everybody.